as Jay mentioned, I actually just moved to Cornell Tech in January 2018. We moved, my family, this is Justin, Simon, Case, and myself, to Roosevelt Island, straight from California. So I actually literally live in the house over there. My children go to school at PSIS 217. I know some of you guys, some youngsters here, I don't know if you recognize a friend up here. I actually grew up in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley. I saw it go from being a place with orchards to like all these high-tech startups. I went to Stanford actually for undergrad. And aside from a couple years I spent at MIT, I kind of lived in the Bay Area my whole life until I moved here. And it's been very exciting, I have to say. I would always read all these magazines and see all these things, cool things that are going on in New York, museums that I would like to visit, restaurants I would like to try. And like now we're here and we actually do those things, and it's really, really wonderful. I do research in interaction with automation, and as part of that I teach a class on interactive device design. These are some pictures from students in my class. This is work in progress where people are making like digital keyboards, or little speech agents, things that like listen to things that you're saying and kind of give you feedback. So I teach the course where people learn to prototype interactive devices with Raspberry Pi and Arduino. I have people from every one of the different departments that we have at Cornell Tech in here. So we have people from business, we have people from law, we also have electrical computer engineering people, information science people, computer science people, even operations research students in this class, and they learn to prototype things that like interact with people. I also have a robotics lab that is shown with Professor Gil Artsy and Dan Lee. We're actually in the process of moving to a bigger lab on the 3rd floor. This is a picture of the previous lab. And we basically prototype different kinds of robots. And I also have a driving simulation lab. Let's see. So this is on the 3rd floor in this building. We have an actual car chassis. It's not a real car because it has no engine. And this is a short clip of another film crew filming someone driving in it. But we basically have it set up so that you sit in what feels like a real car, and there are screens all around, so it feels like you're driving. And it's realistic enough that if people feel like getting out, they always feel like they have to park the virtual car before they get out. We also have an actual car, not an actual autonomous car, just a car that's instrumented so we can actually tell how people behave when they're driving. And sometimes we run simulated autonomous driving experiments. So I don't know if you know, there's legislation, you can't actually run an autonomous car in New York City, but we can actually fake automation enough that we can see how people will respond to different kinds of automation scenarios, and we can do that by driving on the real road. In our studies, there's always an actual trained human driver behind the wheel. So the reason why I came to Cornell Tech is that I'm really excited to work in this area that I thought New York was the right place to work on, which is studying interaction with automation. And I will just say right off, because people always ask me about that, isn't that an oxymoron? Isn't the whole point of automation that you don't have to deal with the machine anymore? And one of the really ironic things that we're discovering is the more you actually delegate activities to a machine, the more you have to wonder, how do I know that the machine will do the thing I'm asking it to do? How can I tell when it's done, done things well or done things poorly? How can I tell when I need to pay attention and when I don't? And understanding these issues is going to be a persistent problem with any kind of interaction we have with systems that aren't under our direct control. So this is actually a point that's made really well by this wonderful MIT professor, David Mendel. He has a book called Our Robots Ourselves, and in his book, he actually goes through all these historical case studies of systems that were supposed to be purely autonomous and require no human interaction. And one of the things that we're discovering as we have more and more actual automation is that, in fact, interaction is one of the key problems that we have. That's actually one of the most challenging things. And so the way that my research group deals with it is that we actually study interactions by simulating autonomous systems that have yet to be built and collecting information about how people will behave so that we can actually have models about how people respond and think about how to design the systems to interact with them. And here's an example of that from a study that I ran at Stanford with my researchers, looking at how people interact with a garbage can robot. Study. I will emphasize we actually do pilot this trash can robot around, but in this study we actually have a human controller who can see all the interactions unfolding, who's actually controlling things, so that if people talk to the robot, for example, it knows to wiggle or move forward and backwards, so that we can actually have contingency, which is to say that we can actually adapt the robot's response to things that people are doing and find out how they'll respond to different things if the robot performs those actions. That's actually something that's really hard to do with a purely autonomous system, which you have to program based on what people are going to say, which you can't do if you don't know what people are going to say. So this is a way of building up a lexicon of things that people might do so that you can actually build a truly autonomous system. One of the things that's really great about doing this kind of study is the things that you learn that you didn't know you're going to learn, and things that you didn't even know would be an issue. So that clip of the little boy who was trying to get the robot to move across the room by baiting it with pieces of garbage. We were like, what is going on there? That's so funny. He thinks that the robot wants to eat garbage. And then as we were looking through the other videos, it was more subtle, but always there. It was clear a lot of people have this mental model that the robot is going to eat the garbage. And in fact, we very often, when we're designing interactive systems, we model the interactions like we would have with another person that was doing the job. So we were thinking of the robot like a busboy, someone that comes and collects the garbage. And we expected people to thank the robot after it took the garbage. But because people's model was that the robot was eating the garbage, they expected to be thanked when they fed the robot. And that's just an inversion we just did not see coming. And this is one of these really interesting things. In the area of human-robot interaction, there are a lot of people who have issues with what's called anthropomorphization, which is when people mistake a robot for another person. There are definitely people who are working on robots that are so realistic that you could almost mistake that robot for another person. And there are a lot of people who think this is really unethical. But you can see that people are treating our trash barrel robot in a social manner, and they also make these cognitive models that aren't really literal. They don't think it's like a biological being. No one really thinks it's like chewing or digesting the trash. That just makes sense from a narrative standpoint, and everyone goes with it. It's not just children, it's adults, and this is, at the Stanford Business School and in the engineering school, it's just smart adults, But that's the thing that makes sense in the moment. And I've talked to roboticists who are like, well, maybe if it talked to them, people wouldn't make that mistake. Just think like, if people are gonna make this a cognitive model, we should work with it as designers. Here's another study in the car space that we ran to look at how people are going to interact with driverless vehicles. You might know that there are autonomous cars on the road, but in most places where we have them, there's always a safety driver behind the wheel. So we actually don't know how people will respond when there's not someone to look at in the driver's seat. And so we came up with this way to kind of investigate how that's going to work. One of my points of pride with this research protocol, it's just a way of running experiments, is that when we were devising it and had some early test results, I showed it to people that I was working with at Ford, who were working on autonomous vehicles. And one of the people I was working on, he was like a big person in Society of Automotive Engineers. He's kind of made up a lot of the kind of definitions of the levels of autonomy. He told me this was the stupidest thing he's ever seen. And then he literally is running a pilot program with Domino's Pizza to look at last mile delivery using this protocol now. So, I think we need to change some minds. So I think one of the things that is an inversion of the way that engineers normally think about things is they really are trying to build systems and build systems that work. So the sort of thing that we're doing where we're like faking systems so we understand how people react, it's a little bit the opposite of what they normally do. In traditional engineering, what happens is that they kind of sometimes do marketing research up front and find out what people want. They spend a lot of time kind of building a system that works, and then they study it to make sure it's not going to kill anyone. They run human factor studies at the end. One of the things that happens when you start to have autonomous systems is that you'll have behaviors and interactions and basically conversations with the machines, and so you actually can't build the system properly without anticipating all the things that people are going to do. And so the reason why we have to use these techniques that we're using right now, where you actually have to fake the system before you have the system, is so that you can elicit the behaviors that you're actually trying to design to. And so that's actually one of these things I think we can bring to the engineering community. In some ways, I sometimes joke about it as the theater of the car. Like we basically are performing a kind of theater, pulling out the behaviors that people have in response and using that as part of design material. Here's another example. We want to kind of understand what kinds of things will make people comfortable or nervous in the self-driving car. We want to be able to do that on the road with all the things that happen on the road. And we didn't want to actually endanger anyone. So this is an instrumented car that has fake automation, and then some of our first participants using that system.
How did the drive go?
Oh, it's pretty amazing.
No auto.
I guess the computer is pretty cautious, which is pretty awesome. There's a number of obstacles that I could have imagined being pretty troublesome for a computer car. It seems to navigate through them all. A flock of people on the side of the road, on this really small street, like construction, like traffic, and all these different situations where it just basically did the right thing.
I actually should explain the setup. The view that we have right now is that the view that the research wizard driver, we call it, a Wizard of Oz, the person, magician behind the curtain, the wizard driver has. The participant is sitting in the passenger seat. There's a steering wheel taped in front of that person, so they can't think that that steering wheel is real. And then there's actually a researcher in the back seat.
Yeah, it's much better drive than most.
So how did the ride go with $70?
I was impressed. It went very well.
Did you feel nervous at any time?
I did. There was a construction site that we went past. There was a construction vehicle, and the guy was waving for me to move. So I sat there like a retard. I was scared. I didn't like wave to the guy or anything. So I was like, I really hope the car doesn't park. So the car backed up, and then the guy made more hand signals.
Did you trust the vehicle?
I just don't fully trust that car to drive on its own. Even though I had no bad experiences with this car, it just seems strange to me still that car can drive itself.
We will now turn on the original subject, and the first will now be Park. Please say hello. Did you notice the car say hello?
I did.
What was it like?
It was an engine roar.
Okay. Did it make you feel uncomfortable or hurt?
No, I thought it was very friendly.
Was it very mad?
What I imagine it was smooth, cautious, but normal driving experience, kind of what makes it cool. I think I was surprised how much I trusted it. Even from the beginning when it said hello, that one thing like gave it enough personality for me to trust it. It made me feel like even though it wasn't a human, it wasn't of malicious intent.
But it just was driving carefully, slowly. Actually, it reminded me of like a driving school instructor.
Was this Batman driving okay with you?
No, it was ideal. I can definitely own one of these. How do I leaving in 10 years?
So I will say that when we ran the study, we actually had people fill out consent forms, so they understood they were in the study, how much they're being paid. But it actually said in the consent form that there was always a licensed human driver behind the wheel. And it's possible that they didn't totally believe us, or it's possible that it just feels enough like an autonomous car that people get in the moment. But you can kind of see there's multiple people involved in the running of the study. There's an experimenter outside the car, there's an experimenter in the backseat of the car, there's an experimenter, on the left, and there's somebody else doing the post-interview. So because the team was switching roles, we didn't totally understand that people thought the car was really autonomous until after the fact when we were analyzing the data, and that was a surprising thing to us. And this is actually now a protocol that many people who are doing academic research in automotive driving, the human side of it, and people in industry are using now. I'm going to show you this final thing just to show kind of the research that we have before we get to the kind of topic at hand. This is actually research that is led by David Godek. He's one of my PhD students here now. This is work that he did when he was a master's student with me at Stanford.
Does it feel like I'm in a car?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Can you put your hands out forward? Right. I just need the
POV
kind of
means point of
center
view.
in your vision. And now you can just if you drive straight,
Sure.
you'll be going this.
And so that car is actually programmed so that it will always run into this car,
Oh god.
the virtual car.
Oh god.
Just it was funny. Like it was a car hitting them with VR.
Oh, really?
Oh god. Out of control.
So the wizard driver is like that. So they're actually driving in a parking lot. They're driving in a straight line, but the person who's a participant in the study has this virtual reality view and can actually we can do things that aren't safe to do in the physical world. But with all the physics of the actual physical world, so people actually feel like they're in the car and really moving, because they are really in a car and they are really moving, and they hear the sounds and stuff like that of the car. But we can actually stage things that you normally would have to do in a driving simulator in a lab. And this is actually something David is doing, and he is doing it on Roosevelt Island. You should never see a car with someone with VR glasses in the driver's seat coming from that lab, but you will see experiments where people are in the passenger seat this way. So let's get to the topic of today's conversation. So you can kind of see the research that we're doing in general. And one of the things I'm very excited about right now is this, the importance of cross-cultural differences as we think about interaction with automation. Normally when we think about cross-cultural issues in design, we think about something like this. This is Coke bottles in Israel, so there's both English and Hebrew Coke. And we think about like how you translate names and how you do branding so that things work in multiple cultures. One of the apocryphal stories in design is the story of the Chevy Nova. The idea that I heard when I was a youth was that the people who came up with the name for the Nova didn't do their homework, and they didn't think about the fact that Nova means don't go in Spanish. So like this car is sold horribly in Latin America. This turns out not to be true. This car sold like hotcakes in Latin America, and in fact, because the weather is better, those things actually last a long time, and we were on the road for a good deal of time. So, that this is the kind of thing that we think about when we think about cross-cultural differences. I think one of the things is when we start to have systems that have interactive behaviors and are doing deep learning, the question of like where we actually program and design the systems becomes a much bigger deal. So the cross-cultural differences will become much more than a branding issue. And so I read things that people in technology naively say with dismay. This is a quote from Rafi Krikorian, who runs the autonomous driving program at Uber ATC in Pittsburgh. And he argues that if we can drive in Pittsburgh, we can drive anywhere. I just think, anywhere? Anywhere? This is India. That was Ireland before. This is Israel. Even in California, where they have been testing cars, where the weather is good and the roads are paved and they have very good, cellular and Wi-Fi access, they have cultural driving issues. This is actually a article from Wired, and they said why people keep rear-ending self-driving cars. And the answer is because self-driving cars don't drive like people-driven cars. They drive legally, but they drive much more cautiously. And one of the things that they do is they are very slow off the mark at a stop sign, especially if they are not sure about what's going on in the intersection, which is all of the time. And so they actually get in crash rear-end accidents 10 times more than human drivers. So we know the law. If you rear-end someone, you're at fault. But if you found out the person in front of you was rear-ended 10 times more than a normal person, you might think you were less at fault. And I would agree. It's one of the things that the reporters have noticed is that the California crash reports make clear that humans expect other humans to bend or break traffic rules, but then the people who are designing the systems feel like there's a conundrum because they feel like, well, should we drive the way that everyone's driving, or should we drive the way that the machine wants to drive? And I think it's very possible there are things that are both legal and safe, but the robots aren't doing them. And that can be a problem. And I think that if you look at that, the fact that the cars are doing it, they're driving in a way and it's just not like the way that humans drive, this kind of thing becomes a little bit clearer. This says, wielding rocks and knives, Arizonans attack self-driving cars. And so normally the story that people tell about this is that, autonomous cars are going to risk jobs for people who have driving as a livelihood. And I think that's possible. But I think far more people are just really angry to be behind a car that just doesn't seem to know whether to go or not, and they basically think the cars drive like jerks, and the fact that they don't respond to the signals that people are giving off all the time about what's expected makes people really angry at a deep psychological level. So I basically am arguing that in order for us to really have autonomous cars that really work safely on the road, it's going to be important for those cars, not only to drive the way we drive, but also understand what it is that we're saying with our driving, understand the way that we drive and communicate with each other with our driving. And so, based on the research I've shown you before, it probably doesn't surprise you to know that I think that we can use kind of novel simulation methods to illuminate these differences. We all know, if you ever rented a car and then driven someplace that you're not from, like about how there are these differences in driving. Like you know how to operate the car, but you get out on the road and it's like a totally different ballgame. It's like, you can't tell what you have to do to be able to merge in, you can't tell if the car in front of you is going to go at the intersection. And there's basically a lingua franca that we use when we're driving or even walking down the sidewalk that we use to communicate with one another, and it's a very local and culturally specific language. And my argument is that we can actually go beyond that kind of anecdotal understanding that we know things are different. We couldn't put it into a math formula for you. We couldn't pinpoint like these are the things you would look at to know that how it's different. If we could actually do those things, we could actually teach machines to drive the way that we do. So some of the stuff I've done in the area of cross-cultural driving is just, first of all, just to look at what it is that people are looking at and tuning to when they're in cars in different places. For people who know any of the cross-cultural difference literature, this is kind of amazing study that came from University of Chicago, I think, where they discovered that people who come from Western cultures, like for example, if they're asked to describe a fish tank, will describe like the biggest, fastest fish in the tank. The people who come from Eastern cultures tend to describe the back of this tank, how big the tank is, how much water they think there is, how many fish there are. And so there's this kind of like focus on things that are context or in the foreground. So we actually ran a cross-cultural study looking at the differences in what people look at when they're in a self-driving scenario, just to see what it is that people are tuned to and care about. We actually had people sitting in front of a screen with kind of a streetscape of things that are going on. This is San Francisco. And then we also showed them streetscapes in Osaka, which is kind of visually similar. We ran the same study in the Bay Area and then in Japan. So this is Osaka. Drive on a different side of the road, but we tried to line up things that were really similar. And what we found is that people who were from Japan tend to, like when we asked them the post-study questions, people from Japan tend to answer more questions about the salient foreground, more accurately. And then meanwhile, US participants answered more questions correctly about prominent background objects. And this is actually the opposite of what the prior cross-cultural differences literature says. We think it might come from the fact that they might have different levels of confidence in the self-driving. If you feel less sure about the self-driving, you might be looking right in front of the car to make sure it's going to do the right thing. If you feel more relaxed about self-driving, you're more likely to be kind of taking in the view. But we don't actually know what causes those differences, but we at least know that the people are tending to different things. So I'm going to skip this one, just in the interest of time. So one of the things that we're doing right now is a study looking at cross-cultural differences by having people drive in a virtual world together, so that we can actually do more to instrument the driving and find out exactly what the differences are. So we basically have two people, they both wear virtual reality headsets. They're both in their own virtual cars, but they're in the same virtual world, kind of like in Mario Kart. And we set up all these different scenarios where people come to ambiguous four-way stops. We have like merging situations or situations where there's a stopped car and then the other car has to go around it. And we look at the way that people handle the situations and how they signal to one another to negotiate kind of remedy of these situations. So here's an example of what like one person might see if they were doing the study. There is a sensor in the front of the VR goggles that makes it so that we can actually model what the hands are doing, so people can see their hands in the virtual world, And then when they put their hands on the physical steering wheel in front of them, even though they can't see the steering wheel, they see a virtual steering wheel, they feel like they're actually in the world. People who can't see their hands, can't see results of their actions in the world, feel less like they're present in the world. So basically this woman is in a virtual car, and then she's about to drive towards the intersection. So we've run this study both in the US and in Israel to look at the differences of how people drive there. Here's a video from one of the pilot runs of this, and what you see on this screen over here is what this woman over here sees in her goggles. At one point she's gonna kind of adjust her goggles, and you'll see the view actually change. Nope. So this is the person in front of the participants is David Gerdekim, one of the PhD students here. Carmel Zolkov, who's one of the PhD students of Avi Baruch at the Technion, is standing in back. And it's a really cool collaboration that we have going on. So this woman's about to come up to the intersection, and she sees the other woman. And we can't see it, but this woman's gesturing, and she can see it because she gestures back before going.
Wow.
And then actually after going through the intersection, they get a questionnaire that they have to answer by pointing their eyes at the right answer.
He's cracking up.
Yeah, because it's working. You know, it's very exciting when the studies actually work.
The gesture, interesting.
So, you know, this is something, we built this system, we validated it, we're still kind of in the process of actually running participants for the study. But the idea is that by profiling these differences in behavior interaction, we actually do more design machines that work with people. In some ways, it basically requires us to have a deeper understanding of the ways that we're kind of communicating, we never think about it with one another, because it's such a foreign language to machines, and they're not going to understand that unless we communicate that to them. So we have to think of clever ways to kind of get this information in a way that machines are going to understand. So with that, I mean, I'm at kind of the end of my prepared slides, and then I'm happy to answer any questions you have about this research, my teaching, life on the island, anything.